Before we jump into today's episode, quick disclaimer that this podcast isn't therapy. It's educational, not individualized advice. Everyone's brain and story are different, so if you're struggling, reach out to a licensed pro who can support you.
We talk about the stuff no one dares. ADHD, sex, and the science that cares. Real talk, raw truth, and the stories that heal. Welcome to ADHD Realities with Dr. B.
Hello, fam. Welcome back to ADHD Realities. I'm your host, Dr. Leanne Borneman. And in all honesty, this is the night before I'm supposed to drop this recording. Completely forgot about it. I have been sick. I have been overwhelmed. But I am determined to make sure I get my episode out. So I was perusing. What do I want to talk about today? And it's very easy for me to find something that pisses me off that I want to talk about, or something that I just find interesting that I want to talk more about. So I'm going to lean into the category of what pisses me off, because that's just the vibe I'm feeling. So we're going to make this easy as possible for me. What pisses me off is seeing two sides of the spectrum when we're talking about ADHD and relationships online, right? You got one side with a narrative of, don't date somebody with ADHD. It's too much of a hassle. They're emotionally unsafe, or you're just going to end up parenting them. And then you have that flip side where people are talking about how ADHD is a superpower. We're just these passionate butterflies. Maybe you're the problem, right? We live in a world that wasn't designed for us. You're the problem. Okay. Those are two narratives. Okay. And then I'm sitting in this corner observing these two sides of the narratives, the spectrum narratives, if you will. And I'm just like, can we slow the fuck down for a second? Because, not for nothing. Some of the pain that people are talking about when we are talking about ADHD and relationships, it is very fucking real. I see it in my office all the time. I've lived it. I get it. But the way we're framing this whole conversation, I think it's very much incomplete at best. And at worst, it's just fucking wrong. So the question I want to dig into today is, are ADHD relationships inherently hard or harder? Or are we just maybe measuring them using standards that were never designed for brains with executive function barriers? Because those then become completely different conversations, right? And I think most people are just having the wrong one. So I want to start with the data. Now, when I had to do my dissertation, I read every piece of literature there was at the time on ADHD and relationships and ADHD and sexuality. And the data was very clear from what was out there at the time and what still aligns, that when we look at ADHD, the research is showing that there are higher relationship dissatisfactions when at least one partner has ADHD. We are looking at more conflict, higher reports of emotional volatility, higher divorce rates, more resentment around maybe who's doing what. Again, that's very real data. I'm not making it up. It's out there. But where I start to lose my mind a little bit on this is that most relationship research, it measures satisfaction using things like consistency, predictability, emotional regulation, follow-through, reliability, low reactivity during conflict. And I'm like, okay, but what are those things actually? Those are, you guessed it, executive function capacities, planning, inhibition, working memory, emotion regulation, task initiation. So when we say ADHD relationships have lower satisfaction scores, we're really kind of measuring executive function strains, aren't we? We're not measuring love. We're not measuring connection or commitment. We're measuring whether someone can consistently execute neurotypical relationship behaviors. And that distinction, oh boy, that matters a fuck ton, my peeps. And when we look at executive function, because we don't talk enough about this, your executive function isn't just a fucking school or work thing. It is a relationship thing as well. Think about what long-term relationships actually are requiring of you, right? You have to remember the conversations. You have to follow through on the plans. You have to manage shared responsibilities without your partner having to remind you. You have to regulate your tone when you're pissed off, don't you? You have to not interrupt. Pause before you say something you're going to regret. Hold multiple perspectives all at the same time. And then you also got to plan for the future together and initiate repair after a fucking fight. My friends, that's all executive functioning. So when a non-ADHD partner is saying things, like, why can't you just remember? Or why are you always late? Or why do you blow up over nothing? Or, I feel like I'm the only adult here. Oh my God, I cringe with that one. They're describing the executive function breakdown. And that breakdown absolutely impacts the relationship. I'm not saying it doesn't. But what gets lost in this is that executive functioning barriers is not immaturity. It's not laziness. It's not about not caring. It's impaired regulation of behavior over time. And that is a neurobiological thing. Now, and this is really important because explaining something doesn't excuse it. You will hear me preaching that from the fucking rooftops. If your ADHD symptoms are repeatedly hurting your partner and you're doing nothing to manage them, that becomes a relationship problem. And that's on you. ADHD explains the behavior. It does not absolve you of responsibility for harm or the expectations both of you have for the relationship. And that nuance right there, that's where most of those online conversations are completely falling apart. And let's talk about another thing that comes up the most here too, the parent-child dynamic. It's one of my favorites because you got one partner who becomes the manager and then the other partner becomes the managed. Nothing sexy about that. And so then you have the non-ADHD partner tracking appointments, handing bills, remembering birthdays, initiating hard conversations, planning vacations, following up on shit that needs to get done. And eventually there's going to be resentment. Resentment galore. And also keep in mind that this manager versus being managed can also happen even when both people have ADHD. Because executive functioning barriers are lived on a spectrum. And unfortunately, what I see often in my clinical practice is that somebody, if both people have ADHD, somebody seems to always have more of the managerial job in the relationship. Whether there's real bandwidth there or not for it, it doesn't matter. I do see that. So this is not just ADHD versus non-ADHD partner, okay? And when we're looking at relationships like this, where you have that manager versus the managed, from that outside perspective, it can look like, at least for the ADHD partner, that they're being irresponsible. But when we look at that neurological side of things, what's happening is a breakdown of task initiation, of time perception barriers, of working memory strains, the avoidance when a person becomes overwhelmed, and then that emotional shutdown that can occur when they maybe even feel criticized. So here's where then I'm going to kind of annoy both sides, because sometimes the ADHD partner really is avoiding building systems. They lean on, this is just how my brain works. And they're not pursuing treatment or support or doing anything to manage it. And that, I'm sorry, is a fucking problem. But sometimes the non-ADHD partner is overfunctioning because of their own anxiety. They step in fast. They take over before their partner even gets a fucking chance to try. They micromanage. And then that reinforces the helplessness. And so both things then can be true at the same time. So what then looks like irresponsibility might actually just be executive overload. And what looks like nagging might actually be anxiety about everything falling apart. And then when you really take a step back, neither partner is wrong or crazy, but the system becomes unsustainable. And when one person feels like the parent and the other feels managed, like I said, there's nothing fucking sexy about that. So your intimacy is going to die. Hello, floppy dicks and drier than Sahara Desert. And that's not because at the core ADHD ruined it. but because the executive load wasn't distributed in a way that worked for you both. Now, another thing that you have to also bring into this conversation is emotional intensity. And I'm going to go there because when we look at an ADHD nervous system, we are more likely than not to be more reactive. So when we think of emotional regulation, that is also an executive function. So when that inhibition, so the brake, right, is having a barrier to it, those emotions are going to move faster than maybe you can think about them. And then that can look like explosive reactions or defensiveness or shutting down completely, rejection sensitivity spirals, catastrophic interpretations of like maybe a normal tone. Now, here's though where I really need you to understand, and I'm going to get a little clearer on here, is because if you are consistently exploding or you're blaming or you're gaslighting, refusing accountability, that is not ADHD. That's you being a fucking asshole. That is unmanaged ADHD. ADHD makes you more vulnerable to dysregulation. It does not make you cruel. Your partner deserves safety, period. End of fucking stop. But, and the non-ADHD partner needs to hear this part also, not all emotional intensity is toxicity though. You know, some ADHD relationships are deeply expressive. They're passionate, they're animated, they're creative, they're like high effect. And that right there is then not a problem. The problem becomes a lack of regulation and then repair. And those are different things. And again, this goes back to what are you two okay with in your relationship? What are the expectations in your relationship that you have agreed or not agreed to? Have you even fucking talked about them? That's another good question to ask. I digress. That's for a whole other episode. Now, outside of the emotional intensity part, I then think of another layer when we're talking about ADHD relationships is the concept of the novelty, right? The boredom and the relationship curve. Because when we look at that early stage for a second, this is where people really start pointing fingers, right? ADHD relationships often start really intensely for a lot of people. Now, this isn't a true statement for everybody, but I'm speaking in what I've seen, and yes, it is on the side of intensity when things start for a lot of people that I've worked with. But when we look at it, think of it, hyper focus, rapid bonding, high stimulation, right? You got new things, so it's stimulating and it's helping those dopamine receptors to fire more frequently. You've got deep conversations, maybe you've got strong sexual chemistry, maybe you're texting all night, and then things shift. The routine sets in, the responsibilities come back, the novelty drops, the executive demands increase. It's kind of like a vacation and you came back to fucking reality, right? And then somebody at some point in time is like, where did the spark go? You've changed. You don't try anymore. But I'm going to pause here for a second because what really is happening here is that the early stage was fueled by novelty-based attention. And then the long-term stage requires sustained executive engagement when you really unpack it. And again, those are different neurological systems. And so this is why tons of people with ADHD struggle when this happens. Again, I'm going to repeat it. Not everyone struggles when you go from the exciting newness to the more sustained relationship. But ADHD brains at the core, they aren't incapable of long-term intimacy. It's context dependent, okay? ADHD isn't the stamp of you can or you can't. But a lot of people who have ADHD, they often do need intentional novelty, those clear structures, less, I don't know, I want to say chaos in like the negative way, and more explicit expectations. That's accommodation. And so the question most couples never ask is, have we even designed this relationship to support both of our nervous systems? Or are we just expecting spontaneous consistency from a brain that's potentially really more on the side of being wired for variability and attention? Because one of those is realistic and then the other is not. Now, talking about stimulation and the novelty, I think the other part of the conversation that gets missed a lot is another layer surrounding this concept of now needing to just try harder because you're in a relationship where either one or both of you have ADHD, right? Are ADHD relationships harder? Okay. What I think, both as a clinician and as someone who's living this, they're not inherently harder. They are harder when symptoms go untreated, when shame is running the show, when one partner is carrying all the load or the majority of the load, when your expectations are rigid, when accommodations are getting framed as maybe even unfair, when there are no repair skills, right? But they can also be creative, emotionally expressive, adaptive, playful, deeply connected, non traditional in ways that will and do work. And the research shows strain, yes, but it doesn't always show what happens when you redesign the environment. And that's what's missing. And so, if you are in an ADHD relationship or you're thinking about one, the question really isn't, is this broken? You need to ask the question of, are we measuring this using neurotypical metrics without accounting for executive functioning barriers? Are we sharing the load in a realistic way? Are we building systems or just blaming each other? I'm sorry, I will die on the hilltop saying this. I don't believe ADHD ruins relationships. I just don't. I believe unmanaged executive function barriers can, for sure. I believe rigid expectations can. I believe shame can. Lack of accommodations can. And if we want better outcomes in our relationships, we need to start measuring those relationships through a more neurologically informed lens. And you can't do that until you know what the fuck it means to have ADHD. Get the support. Read a book. Read a peer-reviewed article. I've got so many resources. Reach out to me for them. And that right there is a conversation I don't think we're having loud enough yet. And we really need to. Because you cannot create supports and you cannot learn how to create systems if you don't know what the fuck you need. And you won't know what the fuck you need until you know who you are and what it means. And that, my friends, is the ADHD reality. Thanks for hanging out with me on ADHD Realities. Hit that subscribe button and share it with a friend who gets it. And always remember, your brain isn't the enemy. Work with it and not against it. Until next time, everyone, be well.